Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. In 1994, 18-year-old Kirk Jae James was a college freshman with no prior record. But he made the mistake of getting caught in the net of the Rockefeller Drug Laws. And for that, the state of New York stole his life. He was denied bail and processed through Rikers Island, where Jay died in a very real sense. In his place, the state created 94A6325, a number branded onto a new piece of state property. The number would define the next 3,268 days of his existence. You might expect that the story to end in despair. You might expect it to end in violence. And for countless others, it does. But for Jay, something else happened inside those walls. Surrounded by systemic violence and racial tension, in places like Coxsackie, known as the Cat, he found something unexpected: mentors. Elders called Pops and Ninja didn't just teach him to survive, they taught him to think. They introduced him to revolutionaries like George Jackson and Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon, and in doing so, they gave him the tools to decolonize his mind. He began to see that his cage wasn't just made of steel. It was built on a historical foundation of slavery, maintained by the loophole in the 13th Amendment of the USA. When he was finally released in 2003, after 3 parole denials and a deportation order he had to fight, he didn't just walk free, he walked out with a mission. Today, Dr. Kirk Jae James is a professor at NYU, and he uses his voice to advocate for one thing: abolition. Not reform, not repair, but the complete dismantlement of a system he argues is a direct descendant of chattel slavery. His life is proof that you can force a garden to grow through concrete. But his question to us is this: why should anyone have to? It's an honor to have you on the show, dear Jay. The Raja Press will be publishing your outstanding book shortly. I would also like to introduce you to our 2 co-editors, Ayo Ogunremi and Russell Lamy, who are going to discuss your life, your book, and our journey together. Welcome, Ayo. Welcome, Russell.
Thanks for
Hello, hello.
Great to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for that incredible introduction.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Maybe just to start off, we could get Jay, if you want, like speak more about the work that you currently do, just so we get a better picture of it.
No, thank you. And I mean, thank you again for that just incredible introduction. In terms of titles, I'm a professor at NYU Silver. A lot of my work is about abolition, but it's also about really rethinking. You know, I don't think we can talk about a world without jails and prisons, without fundamentally like rethinking what it means to be human, our relationships to ourselves, our relationships to each other, our relationships to the planet. I run the Doctorate of Social Work program at NYU, and I also oversee a project called Evolve in Justice, where we create spaces and conversations to really massage this idea of justice and who's deserving of justice and what does it look like? What does it mean for us as a world to co-create justice?
Thank you so much for that.
And yeah, maybe could you explain to us, Feroz already mentioned like the title of your book, 94A6325. Can you just tell us concretely, break it down for us? What does that mean?
Absolutely. So 94, if you're arrested in New York State, in New York City, you're ultimately, and you're convicted, which over 90% of the people that are often entangled in these systems are ultimately convicted. You are then sent to a state processing facility, which I liken to maybe the door of no return. It's a place where you go. It's a place where, in Feroz's introduction, I really loved it because the human part of me ceased to exist. And instead, I was branded a number. And this number is what my family needed to know to visit me. This number is what they needed to know to send me letters, communication, to advocate on my behalf. And this is what happens to, again, most people who are convicted in a state facility. So my number 94 means it's a year. So the 94 is the year 1994. A means that I was processed at a maximum security prison. In my case, it was downstate maximum security prison. And 6325 means that I was the 6,325th person to be processed at downstate correctional facility. So put that in context. This was, I went to downstate about September, and there are different lines, right? So there's A, and then there's B, C, Ds that, means different reception facilities. But in the reception facility I went to at that point in the year, I was the 6,325th person to be processed, and that was only September. So that tells you that there were thousands more that would come behind me.
Yeah, because that's just for people arrested in 94, as well as just in the A track. There were 6,325.
Yes, exactly. It just, I love it. It's just like the A track, right? Then we don't know what happened on the B track, what happened on the C track. But, for the A track, people in that came through downstate, 6,325th person that actually came through downstate in 1994. So yeah, there's thousands more that came after me. There are thousands more that went on the B track, that went on the C track. So, just really put it in context too, right? This was an era in the 1990s. I like to call it the carceral genocide because we went from a prison population in New York that was 200,000 in the 70s. By the 90s, it was over 2 million. And statistics showed that 1 in 3 Black men had a likelihood of incarceration. You put that into context with, the policies that were being passed, because this wasn't, we weren't seeing a crime rate that justified this level of incarceration. What we are actually seeing was policies and practices and ideas, beginning with, the 13th Amendment, right, which again, legalized slavery through the form of incarceration. Then you had Black codes, you had convict leasing systems. And then in the 90s, you saw like new forms of Black codes in stop and frisk, in 3 strikes, in Rockefeller Drug Laws, all policies and laws which disproportionately targeted people of color, specifically young men of color of my generation. Again, 1 in 3 Black men had a likelihood of incarceration. One of my friends, Dwight, always says that, at 17, 18, a lot of people are preparing to go to college, but many people of my generation were preparing to do bids. Instead of asking what college we were going to, be like, what jail are you going to end up in? Instead of asking what major, it's like, how much time are you going to get? So, really, it was a generation. And again, if you listen to the music of that generation, 40 of us in the back of a bus, life is a short, you shouldn't be so rough, right? Like, This was all like music that was really speaking to
Mhm.
what the world in many ways had turned a blind eye to.
No, the scale in this era of mass incarceration is just, it's difficult to wrap your head around, like without having lived through that. And having described that, it'd be nice to hear a little bit more about like the initial events around your arrest, and like what was it like being a kid in the 90s, a young black man in the early 90s in NYC. Like how did this manifest itself, like, in your
Yeah.
life?
No, that's a great question. And in some ways I look back at it and I was like, I was prepared because what we were living in state violence, right? So even, growing up, we grew up in the era of the Central Park Five, who are now the exonerated five. But they, in many ways, I think of are the poster children for mass incarceration. So imagine having these young men who were arrested and demonized, and really made to feel like they were the worst people alive. I remember having a conversation with Councilman Yusef Salam, and he talked about being 14, 15, or however young he was when he got arrested, and just feeling like the entire world hated him. Imagine being 15 years old and feeling like the entire world hates you. And I think it was such a beautiful reflection that he shared, and vulnerable reflection, because I felt like that's how most of us felt. The language that we saw about black men in the media, on TV, we were labeled super predators. We were living in an age where, again, as we're seeing with ICE right now, we were experiencing what we would call the alphabet boys, which were all the militarized police that were in our neighborhoods, that were like picking us up like TNT, FBI, ATF, all of these militarized police that were that were targeting us. So in many ways, like growing up in that era, I feel like we were very much like prepared, for incarceration. I remember even before being incarcerated, I can't tell you how many times, undercover cops would just jump out on us because we were black, and maybe there were two or three of us together. So it definitely was an era where we were very conditioned to the threat of incarceration, and especially seeing our friends go missing. I share in the story that after I got arrested, which was, it was horrific, right? I'd never been arrested before. And I remember one of the things that when I got arrested, I believed in this idea of justice. So I felt that, the judge is going to surely ask, right? Like, why is an 18-year-old who had never been locked up before, why is he here? Why is he facing life in prison under the Rockefeller Drug Laws? Can we talk about this? And no one did, right? Like no one stopped. It didn't phase anybody that I was 18 years old and that I had never been arrested before. It didn't matter. They only saw like a black man. They only saw someone who was disposable. They only saw someone who, by all accounts, they were told was a super predator and needed to be taken off the streets. So, again, to answer your question, I really feel that we were all experiencing a culture of mass incarceration. It wasn't just, what happened when we got arrested. It was really, there, and then you even go and you mentioned school too, right? So you look at the school system, and this was the era where, schools were transitioning from what we would call school safety to now police. And I felt so disconnected from the educational system, and so many young black men and black women, people of color, feel so disconnected from the educational system, which again, once that disconnect happens, you're then punished. And research tells us that, like, if you're kicked out or if you're pushed out of these educational settings, then your likelihood of incarceration is exponentially greater. So it really was this very perverse like system, that was operated. And I think like sometimes when we talk about, carceral systems, we only think about maybe the police, but it was the idea of who black men were, which, I think Joe Biden's crime bill speech is really like horrific, but he tells you exactly what he thinks about us, right? He tells you that like there's no hope for them. They need to just be locked away. And I think, like, imagine having a public conversation where you're like, it's either them or, you know, our families, right? They're going to hit my mother, they're going to hit your mother, right? So this was a context in which Black men were coming of age. It was a very ideologically systemic, like, violent era.
And in this context, I mean, not only were you surrounded by this, like the constant pressures, but your journey to your arrest, it wasn't as though you were already doing these things and you were caught by this massive carceral system, but rather you were pushed into doing these things. Like, you were actively entrapped. So do you want to explain a little bit more, like what
Yeah,
that process was like?
exactly. So, you know, I didn't even know the word entrapped, right? Like, and again, I think so many people, we don't even know what this is. So for me, in my case, I had a friend who lured me into, you know, essentially the commission of a crime. Connected me, said, you know, he had some friends that, you know, he wanted me to serve as a connect for. And this process wasn't something that happened overnight. You know, this was something where at 18 years old, I now have, you know, quote unquote friends, men calling my house for months, you know, luring me into being an accomplice for crime for them. And ultimately, after 4 or 5 months, I ultimately, you know, like broke down and became an accomplice. And it turned out that these men were actually undercover police officers. So I remember being arrested and being like, oh my God, like, okay, I know that, you know, my decisions were wrong here, right? But can we talk about how we got here, right? If undercover police officers are going to be calling an 18-year-old for 5 or 6 months, you know, kind of like offering them money to, you know, to kind of like ultimately commit a crime. I didn't feel that was justice. And that's when I learned the term entrapment. And that's when I began to realize how entrapment is such a big part of the system that no one speaks about. There was a particular book that I read, you know, Elaine Bartlett, Life on the Outside. And her story was that she was working in a barbershop or in a hair salon in Harlem. And it was around the holiday times, and someone she knew would always come into the salon. And that person came in and said, like, hey, I know times are rough for you. You know, I have a package. If you could just bring it to, I think it was Albany somewhere, you know, be able to give you $1,000. Obviously, she knew that, you know, probably there was something in the package that, you know, was probably sketchy, right? But this is also a woman with kids. It's a holiday time, and someone is saying, like, hey, to bring a package somewhere, I'm going to give you money that you can able to buy your children gifts. You can support your family the holidays. She ultimately accepts and takes a package. And it would turn out that she was being set up, right? That they were all part of a undercover operation. And reading her book and, you know, the research that was done in her book, I realized that entrapment is a big part of the carceral system, and people are actually incentivized. So what happens is, if someone gets arrested, you know, what they'll say is like, hey, can you get us a few other people, find us some people that are selling drugs, and they then ultimately like create these things. So I feel that, you know, my story is interesting in the sense that, like, there's not a lot of conversations around how entrapment, like, is again like really a tool of the carceral process.
Hmm. Could you maybe explain some of the main characters in your life, like leading up to um, your arrest? So, like, Polo plays a pretty big role in this. Um, there's Heather, obviously your mom and your stepdad. Yeah, could you just paint us a picture of, like, what was your life like leading up to April
Leading up
4th?
to my arrest. So I had a lot of struggle with school. Like, let me back up a little bit. So I came to the US in 1986. And as an immigrant who had grown up in Jamaica, I really struggled with school in America. So I felt, you know, at 18 years old, you know, I was pushed out of high school. I'd gotten a general equivalency degree. and I was at Nassau Community College studying criminal justice. And I really felt like, I was finding my stride. So this was really this is maybe, a year up to my arrest. I'm, a college freshman. I'm finishing my first semester of college and really beginning to kind of like think about like a professional future. So for me, the irony is this, that like I really never could have even imagined becoming arrested. Like even though like I was definitely growing up in an era again where there were so many people being arrested. I really saw myself going to college, ultimately like figuring out some profession along the lines. And really coming of age too in 1993, 1994, before my arrest, I like to say that this for me was like the golden age. I'm 18, 19 years old, like music is incredible. This is the era of like so many Wu-Tang Clan, Nas, Biggie. So I really legitimately felt like I was a young man who was very committed to living my best life prior to my incarceration. So again, like, transitioning ultimately into being a hookup for undercover agents wasn't like the plan for me. And you asked about Heather too. I knew I had in November of 1993, I found out that I was going to be having my first child. So that was also, a very, I want to say it was a very exciting time in my life, but there's also a lot of uncertainty, right? There was also a lot of uncertainty of like, how was I going to provide for my child? And I never want to use that as an excuse, right, into ultimately my actions. But I think, again, like this was the reality, right? Like I was 18 years old. I had a child on the way. I just completed my first semester of college. And my mother at the time, they were paying for me to go to college out of pocket. And after the first semester, my mom like financially couldn't continue to pay for me to go to college, which in many ways kind of opened the door for me to entertain the person who had been pressuring and calling and luring me. His name was supposedly Eddie. So it allowed me, the circumstances at the time, I felt like opened the door for me to take his advances a little bit more seriously.
So when you are arrested, in like pre-trial like detention, it's Rikers Island when you're picked up in New York City. So you end up spending about like 5 months in Rikers. So what's the deal with Rikers? Like, can you tell us a little bit about Rikers and
Yeah.
your time there and what that was like for an
So
18-year-old kid?
yeah, Rikers it's like hell, right? I think like if there's so many songs about, like there's a reggae song, Kokoti. It's like Minawonga, Rikers Island. There's so many songs that speak about Rikers Island. And I often say that even though I'd not been arrested, I definitely knew what Rikers Island was, right? Like through music, through people that I knew that had been arrested and would come back. And so to put this in context, Rikers Island is a place where it's mostly detainees, right? So people who are not convicted, people who are A, do not have bail, or B, or are unable to make bail. So imagine, at this time, I want to really put it in context, right? The prison system is over capacity. So we have like the greatest influx in incarceration rates in history. And Rikers Island is feeling that. It's overcrowded. I don't know what the exact numbers were, but say for instance, if it's designed for 40,000 people, it was probably at 70,000 people, right? Um, and imagine so many people that are like there, and the levels of frustration, because people often talk about like violence in Rikers Island without put it in context, right? Like imagine you are, in a place where you're literally fighting for your life, meaning, you're fighting the carceral system to not be sent to prison for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. and you're in a place with other people who are similarly fighting for their lives. And there's this collective frustration, right? Like everyone is frustrated. I think people don't really understand how unjust these systems of justice are. So for instance, I remember after seeing the judge after my arrest, I thought I would get bail, right? Like, why not? Whenever we watch TV and we see these things, right? Everybody gets bail, even the people that, you just killed 10 people, you got bail, right? So I'm like, no bail. And not only no bail, you're actually sending me to Rikers Island. So that was just really, I remember just, it was terror, it was a level of terror that like I never experienced before, if I'm being really honest with you, right? And I remember getting to Rikers Island and I remember just feeling like the hopelessness, and how that hopelessness then like really like plays out in violence because, you're on Rikers Island and you don't know when your next court hearing is or your next court hearing isn't for months, right? So everyone is not their best selves. So that plays into a lot of interpersonal violence. And a lot of that violence is really part of the system, right? Because when the violence is taking place, it's usually us fighting each other, which then allows the system to perpetuate violence on us, unabated, right? Because we're too divided. So I just remember getting to Rikers and just really sitting with a different level of violence. And again, that violence wasn't just physical violence, right? It's like being in a system where you're not able to be seen beyond your charges. You go and see the judge and the judge doesn't even look at you, right? The judge doesn't even look at you. It just all feels like an incredibly violent game. And which then also feeds that violence, right? So everyone is just really so frustrated, and it really plays out with each other because in many ways we don't know how to fight the system, but we know how to fight ourselves. Russ, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. So yeah, in this context, there's no way that people are going to be able to like be their best selves, like be at ease, and like the light at the end of the tunnel is like your sentencing when you're on Rikers, and for you, like your sentencing, you end up getting 7 to life at your sentencing. So although like it means the end of the uncertainty that being on Rikers entails of not knowing what your future is, not knowing what the other side's going to look like, what does it feel like to get life in prison at a maximum sentence? What's that like?
And and tell us like how did that actually come about? Like what was the decision that you had to make?
Yeah. So again, like you're in this space, right? You're on Rikers and you're not seeing the judge, right? I think maybe I had 4 court hearings while I was on Rikers. So if you don't have, and most people don't have like good legal representation, and even with a paid attorney, really honestly, you're not getting good legal representation unless you're paying somebody millions of dollars, right? And interestingly enough, like I was on Rikers Island during the time of the O.J. Simpson trial and O.J. Simpson arrest. So to see how, his representation, dream team, while we're on Rikers Island, like, fighting for our lives was really interesting. So again, you're on Rikers Island, right? Let's just put like, I want to paint a picture. You're on Rikers Island, you have no bail. And, you are looking around you and it's really, it's a ocean of destruction, right? Like everyone, no one is getting good news. You're not hearing people come back from court and say, yeah, they're going to let me go. You're hearing people come back from court and say, I got 15 to life. I got 25 to life. I got 10 years. I got 5 to 15. So it's literally, we call that football numbers. All you're seeing all around you is football numbers. So after 5-6 months, we're in this situation, and the attorneys do not want to argue a entrapment defense. I remember every time we would tell them, they're like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm sure." Right? And so you don't have attorneys, right? Because to argue your defense really means that they would have to do their work, and they don't want to do their work. And this is not a shade to attorneys, right? But like, if you look at this specific era, even if you look today, most of these cases are pled out. And by the time you get to that point, right, by the time you get to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, maybe a year of being in this condition, most people are ready to take a plea. Because again, Rikers Island is a detainment facility. It's not meant for people to stay 5 months, 6 months, 7 months. So the conditions are really deplorable. The food is really deplorable. And again, the violence is on a different level. So by the you're having all of these things compounded, and then there's also, like, really honestly, there's a real fear of going to trial, because you don't feel like you're going to get a fair trial if you're in the system and they're not even willing to see your humanity. I'm facing a judge 4 or 5 times. The guy doesn't even look at me. He doesn't even ask me one question to see who I am. Like, am I trusting that going to trial is going to be better, right? So, you really get backed into a corner where you're looking around again, like everyone is like getting football numbers. And you ultimately have to figure out, like, okay, what is going to be, like, how do I get out of here with the least amount of damage? And it's crazy to think of that. I was in a position, and to, again, even put this in context, I remember when I got arrested, they were throwing out numbers like 45 years to life. And, that may sound ridiculous to someone, but some of the charges I had were, again, under the Rockefeller Drug Laws. And to put that in context, each charge under the Rockefeller Drug Law was the equivalent of murder. So, an A1 felony under the Rockefeller Drug Law for possessing 2 ounces or more of cocaine carried a minimum sentence of 15 years to life and a maximum sentence of 25 years to life, similar to murder. And I had multiple A1 felonies under the Rockefeller Drug Laws. So there was a real fear factor here that, that they could really put me in prison for a long time. So when our attorneys came back and said, like, hey, they're willing to give you a plea offer of 7 years to life, it actually sounded good. And I think this is what I wanted people to understand, right? Like, no one would ever take a sentence of 7 years to life at 19 years old. No one. Yet the conditions were such that we didn't feel we had a choice. We actually felt that this was probably the best choice for us to be able to get out of prison, alive. And I think one of the things too with the conviction was they gave us a lot of misinformation, right? So we ultimately took a plea of 7 years to life to criminal possession of a controlled substance in a second. So our attorneys, because it's quote unquote a nonviolent crime, our attorneys told us, oh, you'd get work release in 3 years. You'd get this program in 4 years. You do. So, like we were like, made to feel like, okay, this is, really not 7 years to life, right? This might be like, 3 years at the most, right? Before we get some type of relief that would allow us to get out of prison. So there were numerous factors, right? And I try to really articulate that in a book, because I think for an average person, like, and I think even a good, so the Central Park Five, they all pled guilty to a crime they didn't do. And I think that's what people need to understand, that the system is so violent that it forces you. So many people will ultimately take pleas, to because they understand the violence of the system. And I don't know if, for people who are familiar with Khalif Browder, and I always reference Khalif Browder because I thought he was so incredible, right? To be arrested for a crime he didn't do, and refuse to take even a plea to time served, and experience immense violence while incarcerated, but refuse to take the plea. Most people in this position would gladly take a plea to time served to go home, whether they did it or not, especially the violence he was experiencing. But he stood on business, and ultimately, committed suicide because, like the violence and trauma he experienced was too much. And I think even that, right? Someone that actually was able to be like found not guilty and to leave the space still carried with them so much trauma, right? So imagine the people that don't. Imagine the people that actually are sentenced, that have to go upstate, leave their families further behind, leave their communities further behind. It's really such a violent system. And, like even again, like I felt like I struggled to really write that because I wanted people to understand that, no one just goes into this space and accepts a plea deal, right? Like there's so much violence you're experiencing. There's so much systemic injustice regarding, when you see a judge, what the conversations look like, how you feel, the lack of humanity, which ultimately, the writing is on the wall for you. Like, hey, no, this is like, we don't care about you. The only thing is about how much time you're going to get.
I think, the dehumanization is such like an important part of this process, because I think there's a way in which these things are normalized, that like we see men of color, we see people of color get sentences like this, and we don't really like, think what that entails for an 18-year-old to essentially agree to be behind bars for the rest of their life potentially. And I think that is normalized. We don't think of how devastating that would be, or how impossible that would feel, especially when you feel like it's totally unjust, and like that your story, how this came about is totally unjust. So to be able to look a judge in the face and agree and take a plea must be so difficult, and especially like in this horrifically violent system that's pushing you to take this, because this is a context where you're 18 turning 19, and your daughter's born, like at this point, like you're in
Right.
Rikers and your daughter's born. So this is not a decision you took lightly. Like, and so
Yeah.
this is really a moment to like reflect on like how
Mhm.
violent this system is. That even at that point, even with your daughter born and wanting to be reunited with her, you're still like, that's a good deal. 7 years till
Yeah.
then.
Yeah. And, I often think about too, my mom who has four sons, right? And just, my mom like not being able to sleep, knowing that I'm in this system and knowing that I'm potentially subjecting her to a life of me in this system. And again, like having a daughter that was born a month before I had to take a plea, right? I think it's such a violent system. And I really wanted to put these things in context because, again, like, this was a context of me taking a plea of 7 years to life, right? Like, even I knew my story, I knew how I got there, I knew that I was entrapped. And yet no one wanted to hear that, right? No one wanted to talk about mitigating factors. No one even saw my humanity. And I think that was one of the things that, that really hurt me so much, but it really also pushed me to kind of, become the person I am today, right? Because I feel maybe the most violent thing that we can do to each other is not see our humanities. Um, so really, like, I think so much of the work that I do today is really to attack and dismantle any system that, like that refuses to see the fullness of people, irrespective to an action that they may have perpetuated, right? Because no one is their worst action. And if we're not willing to see people across the spectrum, we're going to create, varied types of carceral systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a good segue. Maybe since you've taken the guilty plea at this point, August, September, right in Rikers, and then you get transferred to downstate, and then to the CAT, right?
Yeah.
And it's in the CAT that you meet Pops, who introduces you to a bunch of revolutionary figures and their writings. So can you tell us about like your early time at the CAT and say
Yeah.
Pops and the rest of the community that you found there?
Yeah, no. So kind of like even coming upstate, right? I just had 6 months on Rikers Island. I am maybe a buck 30, I'm 130 pounds. I've just spent 6 months on Rikers Island. I'm stressed. I've lost so much weight. And so I really was in survival mode, right? I think coming upstate, Coxsackie is, historically one of the most violent prisons probably in the world. And again, like just putting that in context, it's a prison where it's an adolescent. Think about how crazy this sounds. It's an adolescent maximum security prison. So everyone in there is probably between 17 and 20 years old with a minimum of 7 years. And many of those people have 15 to life, 25 to life. So it's, like, again, there's a sense of hopelessness there amongst young people, some with more time than they've been alive, right? So it's incredibly, again, it's a violent place, but it's not just interpersonal violence, right? It's systemic violence that breeds interpersonal violence. So it's an incredibly violent place. It's an incredibly hopeless place. It's an incredibly dark place. And so getting there, especially after, surviving 6 months on Rikers Island, I really was just in survival mode. But I ultimately, started to develop a plan, knowing that, I may be here for a while. And I signed up for the mess hall. And in the mess hall, like, in jails and prisons, serves many purposes. But one of them for me was just the ability to be able to access like different types of food, because you can't survive on prison food. So, you really have to have a plan of like how you're going to eat and survive. And the mess hall is often also like one of the better paying jobs. And better paying jobs means that maybe instead of 5 cents, you're getting 25 cents. So let's be clear with that too, right? So I'm in the mess hall. Maybe I'm in Coxsackie now for 2 months. I'm in the mess hall. And like you'd call them like OG, like an old timer, someone who'd been incarcerated for a long time. Pops, locks across from me. And, he was someone I knew from the yard. We'd work out together every once in a while. But then when I get to A1, we're literally locking right across from each other. And he starts to share books with me. And like at first, I'm just like, okay, this is cool, but I'm not reading any of this. And we would also like work out in the yard, and we'd do pull-ups and stuff like that. And he'd quiz me and be like, hey, did you read this? And I'd be like, I'd fake some excuse why I didn't read it. And then one day he really got upset, and he really began to like tell me his story. And I feel like, not that I wasn't politicized before, but I think it really opened my eyes. And he told me his own story of being a Black Panther and being targeted by COINTELPRO, and ultimately, similar to a lot of Black Panthers in the era, getting a fake conviction, right? And being sent to prison for, at that point, he had 25 years to life, right? For a conviction that he professes innocence. But, Pops, with many people that were in these situations, they became somebody else, right? They didn't like really, they could have just been angry, but they weren't angry. They became like teachers, they became, in many ways, they were like prophets to people like myself. And he began to share his story. We began to read together. I began to really take it a little bit more seriously. And, I remember reading George Jackson and reading Fanon. And these were the stories that really helped me to see myself, really helped me to see my situation in a broader context. Because at 18 years old, when you're going through this, it's like, my God, woe me, why is this happening to me? And as I began to spend time with Pops, as I began to read and to really think about these things historically, I began to realize that this wasn't just me, but this was the Black experience. This was the American experience for so many men of color. And that really began to push me to think about what my role would be. What would be my role if I had an opportunity to get out of prison? And those were questions that became really salient to me. And in some points, I didn't believe I was going to get out of prison. He thought I was going to get out of prison. Other people thought I was going to get out of prison. But I really started to, to really think about that. What would I, if I was reading this and I felt like the rage, and also the accountability, right? Like I felt the accountability to also be able to speak up and challenge these systems. Like, what was I going to do? So Pops was incredibly helpful in not only raising like my political consciousness, but really like pushing me to think about like my accountability towards dismantling systems of oppression, right? Like that my freedom wasn't just me getting out of prison, right? But it was really, and I remember we'd always talk about James Baldwin's letter to Angela Davis, and he's like, "Hey, I may not really agree with everything you do and all your practices, but I'm really clear that they come for you in the morning, they'll surely come for me at night." And really thinking about this intersectional approach to liberation. And these are like the tools that drive me to this day, just really seeing that none of us can be free unless we're all free. So those first years and those first months in Coxsackie were like really powerful, spending time with Pops and in terms of building like my political consciousness. But he was also teaching me how to take care of my body, right? Like we're going to the yard, we're working out, because I think too, like we can, and in some ways, this was like a very holistic, revolutionary program, right? Because I think especially now, there's so much more understanding of trauma and how the body keeps score. And like imagine in a place like jail and prison. So it was one thing that I was being politically conscious, but then it was another thing for me to also like be taking care of my body, right? Be attuned with my body, to be going to the yard, to be building discipline, things obviously that allowed me to be like my best self, right? And tools that would allow me to survive again, like a very dangerous, violent environment. Um, so I look at those months in Coxsackie as just really, I was so blessed to have like a mentor like Pop, who not only raised my consciousness, but really shape me as well too, right? Like you're going to work out, you're going to like lift weights, you go to build muscle, you're going to really learn how to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the value of Pops' mentorship really comes through, and like especially in the context of you're adjusting to this system, you're losing so much hope. And one thing that you write that Pop says that really stuck with me is this idea that the importance of doing time and not having time do you.
Yeah.
So for someone who's just in the system and is being faced with this sense of hopelessness, like how did that land for you? How important was that for you to hear that from Pops?
Yeah, I mean, that was powerful because, like you can feel so hopeless, right? Like again, you don't know when the door is going to open. So what's the motivation? What's the motivation for anything? Especially when you're looking at, imagine, again, like I often want to put this, I got arrested in 94, got convicted in 94. What we're talking about now isn't even a year later, right? So this is not even a year into a 7 to life bid, right? So many people would feel so hopeless. There's, depression sets in, and I had periods of significant depression, right? But just to have someone to say that, like, hey, you have to use this time, right? Like you have to see this time as an opportunity. You have to see this time as an opportunity to build your mind, to build your body, to build your spirit. That was a gift, right? That was a gift for me. And like again, I can't even tell you, because so many people try to sleep away a bit, like you sleep away a bit. I felt like I became a voracious reader, like I would read maybe like 3 books a week, like, and this, if I look at my life today, in many ways, I was prepared myself, but I didn't know that. And that was again, Pops, right? Just saying that, like, hey, you don't know where you're going, but you have to prepare yourself, right? And so, like not having time do you and you doing time was really that, like really I'm not going to sit in my cell and be in despair, right? I'm going to read. I'm going to think about like theories, and does this theory work? Why doesn't it work? I'm going to read George Jackson and understand, how he felt like, we should heal, and I'm going to read Asada and think about, like how do we build community, so it really became, I often say this was like maybe my first doctorate, like it really was the place where I really began to learn to study and to think critically. And it was really because of that again, right? Like I was with Pops from like maybe 5 months, right? From January, I knew him. I met him probably like October when I got to the Cat, but really we lived together on the mess hall block from probably January to May, right? So in like 5 months, was really, and in my infancy too, right? I just came upstate. So to have someone like that to really be a mentor and to really, who had like at that point already like 15 years or something like that and it survived like, immense carnage in those spaces and understood it better than most, right? Like um to have a mentor like that, was just really, it was a godsend. And I feel like, as you know, in the book, I would have other mentors too, similarly, that were just like really godsends. And I think one of the things too that, and I'm happy that you brought up Pops, right, is that we, some of the people that society has labeled monsters are like the people that, are some of the most incredible human beings, and I think that gets lost, right? That like everyone in jail is this monster, or they've committed a murder, or they committed this. And I can tell you without doubt that, for someone who themselves doesn't know if they will ever go home, and probably will never go home, right? And for them to see in you possibility, and for them to invest in you, right? That is like a greatest form of love, right? Love on love in a way that is non reciprocal, like there is no, you're really investing in your values and your ideas of like liberation, and hoping that, that I can really embody and live that out. So, I that hasn't been lost on me, the level of investment that I've received from so many people. And it puts maybe even a degree of pressure on me, because like I feel, I've often said that this isn't my story, even though, it is my story. It's not my story, it's our story. I really wanted this book to be written for every human being who has been marginalized, who's been a number, who's not been seen. So, those early years and those mentors, are people that I take with me everywhere I go, and I hope that my work will always forever be honoring of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just one last thing about Pops, because I think it's really important to mention, uh, to just show like how incredible of a figure he is. So, like you just said, he had already gone 15 years in prison, and it was at that point, that same year in 94, that you met him, that his other co-defendants who took the plea got out. Like, if he had taken the plea instead of going to trial, he would have gotten out the year that he met you. But he still
Wow.
had another 15, something like 15
10.
years to go.
I think
10
get
years to
another
go.
10. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And he still has like the I don't know what to call it, like the strength of mind or whatever,
Yeah.
to approach you with this with this well, yeah, just with this perspective, and is capable of like seeing so much potential in you,
Yeah.
and seeing also his responsibility to you.
Hmm.
I just think is really incredible. Like he he's such an inspiring figure.
Yeah. I'm getting a little emotional. Thank you for putting it that way. But yeah, no, definitely, man. I can't speak enough, like I can't praise enough. And yeah, I don't even have words, but like and even, and I know we're going to talk about, we're moving forward as well too, but even yesterday was my comrade Bliss's birthday, who is a big part of the story as well too. And I just legitimately feel, jail and prison is such a horrible place. And I've met so many incredible people in that darkness that really I couldn't be with, I couldn't be me without them, right? So I have so much gratitude, and this is why I feel like I go so hard, because I know again that many of my comrades are still incarcerated, whether it's in jail or prison, they've been deported, or, they're back in communities with like no access because they're formerly incarcerated. So, this is in the last few years, I have a friend that's in immigration detention as we speak. I have a friend who died in prison a few months ago. So these aren't even things that like have stopped, right? Like these are things that are still like happening right now. So I feel like the only way that I can truly honor, there's so many people who have like again like poured into me so I could be me right now, is to really like not only tell my story but really tell the story of what this carceral genocide really is.
And just picking up on the line of the people you met, like you end up spending about a year and a half in the CAT before transferring across the street to the medium security prison, Green. So it's at Green that you meet some important figures like the aforementioned Bliss. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Bliss or the other people you met at Green.
Yeah. Green was just incredible, right? Like I was in CAT only for I was in CAT from October 94 to maybe like June 95. And then I was in Green from June 95 to December 98. So that's like 3.5 years, right? So I really, the CAT was like, I look at the CAT was like maybe I was being prepared for being upstate, right? And then Green was where I was really going to put these things into practice, because Green, similar to the CAT, was a medium security adolescent prison. So again, right, you're talking about these young kids that are, and I was a young kid myself, right? But like, with significant amount of prison time, significant amount of trauma, right? That are experiencing significant amount of violence. So it creates this very combustible, hostile place. And so I remember getting to Green, and like going from a maximum to a medium security prison is a benefit, right? In some ways, because you have like greater movement, you have greater freedom. And so when I got to Green, I ended up I needed to take they mandate you take certain programs. So one of the programs that I needed to take was called ASAC, Alcohol Substance Abuse Treatment Program. And in that program was where I met Bliss. And I met Bliss because of another friend, Rondu, who I knew from Coxsackie. We worked together in the mess hall. And he and Bliss were from the same neighborhood in Queens, an infamous neighborhood in Queens. And so through Rondu, I would become to know Bliss. Bliss was about 10 years my senior. He was an Army veteran and also a revolutionary, right? But also someone who loved guns and like really struggled with street life, right? So he was a full human being in a spectrum. But Bliss would become, probably I feel God really blessed me with Bliss, because Bliss, out of the 9 years that I'd be incarcerated, I would spend almost 8 of those years with Bliss in different prisons, etc. And Bliss would become like my big brother. Bliss would become like my mentor. And I have so many stories with Bliss, but I'll share something, right? And in 1996, I feel, yeah, it was 1996. Bliss ran a lot of like programming in Green. So he ran like transitional services, and he was like a really great speaker. And we were starting this, he started this program called YAP, Youth Assistance Program. And what the program was going to be was we were going to bring young people into the prison, and we would share our stories with them, as a way of hopefully keeping them out of prison. Many of them had been arrested and gotten in trouble with the law. So it was kind of like a scared straight, but we weren't going to scare them. We were going to just more like share our story. So I remember, Bliss asked me to be a part of this, and I was like, I couldn't even fathom my story helping someone else. I couldn't, I couldn't even conceptualize that. I couldn't even conceive my story helping someone else. And Bliss ultimately, because I had such a love and admiration for him, ultimately convinced me that it would be a good program for me to be a part of. And this really changed my life. I remember, just being in community with these young children, and they were children, like 12, 13, 14, right? This is what we do. We arrest kids. And just really speaking to them about their own lives, speaking to them about, my own story. And, there was just such commonality, and I felt so connected to them. And I remember leaving that first day and just being like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. But it was also so heavy, like just really being in space, and you're sharing so much trauma, you're sharing so much like violence. It was really heavy. And I remember just seeing Bliss in that space, the way he operated, the way he spoke, the realness in which he spoke, but also the way he commanded a room. And in many ways, this became, like, my God, this is who I want to be. I want to be like Bliss. I want to be able to talk to people and people listen. I want to be able to share my story, and my story helps people, right? So again, like Bliss was really, creating a pathway similar to Pops, where I would begin to learn how to share my story, see the power in my story, begin to think about how I can, engage in my story as a storyteller, right? So, I look at some of these things, and I'm so grateful again that, like Pops again, right? Doing time, not having time doing you. Like I was really doing these things that were in many ways like preparing me for a future that I didn't even know awaited me. But Bliss was so instrumental in that. I think about, my role in the academy today, and there's no way that that would have happened without Bliss. So much of, again, of my ability to even see power and purpose in my story comes from my time and experience with Bliss.
So it's also in your time in Green where you get your deportation order. So how does that happen? What's the context, both politically in terms of the laws that are being passed to make that such, and what's your reaction?
Yeah. So in context, right? So when I got locked up in 1994, and because I was sentenced to a nonviolent crime, criminal possession of a controlled substance in second, I knew that there was always a possibility of immigration repercussions, but because of, again, the crime that I was convicted of, I knew there would probably be a strong likelihood that, I wouldn't be impacted. Fast forward 1996. So these laws, again, right, they're all happening at a very, at the time that is feeding mass incarceration. So 1994, you have the 1994 crime bill, which kind of, again, like creates this large policies and procedures that like impact, incarceration rates. In 1996, now you pass new immigration laws. And not only do you pass these new immigration laws, you make them retroactive, right? So you make them retroactive. So for all the people that are being, impacted now under, the crime bill and these toughened crime policies, they're now subjected to, if they have an immigration status, they're now, like myself, subject to deportation. And so I didn't even know about the 1996 crime bill, 1996 immigration laws. And so I remember, this is probably like maybe summer of 1996. Every once in a while, you get what's called legal mail, and I was working on different things. So, and I was always just optimistic too, right? That somehow maybe a judge was going to review my folder and say, hey, something's wrong. Let me, here's a letter. We're going to do something, right? So whenever I got like legal mail that I didn't expect, there was always a level of optimism, like, somebody's going to like see me, right? Like, because there's no way in my mind I thought that I was going to do 7 years, right? No way. I was like, this is impossible. So there was always some level of optimism. I need to put that in context, right? So like I'm going to get legal mail now, and Bliss was with me as well too because he had legal mail that night. And I remember him asking me like, "Hey, what do you think it is?" And I was just like, "Yeah, maybe they reform the Rockefeller Drug Laws. I'm going to get out of prison, blah blah blah." And so I remember like, you go to the law library, then there's a queue. So you wait, you get the letter, and I remember just like staring at the letter because I'm already like serving 7 years to life, and I'm like, it can't get any worse, right? This is end game, right? This can't get any worse. I'm serving 7 years to life. No one, everyone refuses to see me. I'm in some of the most violent prisons in probably the world. And now I'm looking at this letter, and this letter is saying that there's a warrant for my arrest and I have an order of deportation. And I remember just being like, it like I don't have the words even now to tell you of just like how horrible this felt, right? Like again, it just compounded a situation that I didn't think could get any worse. So when I got that letter and I began to then do some research and found out about the 96 immigration laws. And the thing about the 96 immigration laws was that there was no relief, like it was mandatory deportation. So crimes that, they have this term called aggravated felonies, right? So like certain crimes, like, like threshold of crimes are automatically deported. So they expanded that category. So essentially like everything became an aggravated felony, right? So everything was like deportable. So I pretty soon realized that I didn't have any relief. And sure enough, when I saw the judge I saw the judge twice. I would see the judge in the end of 96, immigration judge. And it was more of a formality, him telling me the charges and, that I would need a lawyer or if I wanted a lawyer for the next hearing. But basically told me that he was going to deport me the next hearing, right? And I was just like, so why do I need a lawyer if you're going to deport me? But it's just, these are charades, right? It's all a charade. And so, in January, I believe January, February, 1997, I'm ordered deported. And, that was like, again, it was horrific, right? Because now I'm 3 years into a 7 to life sentence, but now I have order of deportation. So I think there was I don't want to say it was a good thing, right? But then at the same point, so there is, because, and again, this is how the system works, right? Because now there are, the 1996 immigration laws, they pass this maritime parole board for deportation. So now I'm eligible for a parole board for deportation. So I'm like, oh my God. So there's a possibility not only, and this happens really quickly, right? So I go from thinking, okay, I have this sentence to do, to now having an order of deportation, to now, like in a matter of months, going to a parole board with the idea that if I'm released, that they would deport me. And so it's like a mixed bag, right? There's definitely I don't want to be deported, right? Obviously that is terrifying for me, the prospect of deported, but I also want to get out of prison. Like I want to get out of prison. If they said to me like, hey, we're going to send you to Africa, I would be like, okay, let's go. I really, like prison is a horrible place, right? Like if they, so I need to put that in context. And so after a while, I'm like, okay, being deported, I am going to be away from my daughter. I'm going to be away from my family. And there's definitely, that's not what I want. But I also know that if I'm going to be able to like be there for my family, I need to be out of prison. So after a while, I'm like, okay, this is not the worst thing, right? So I start to prepare for the board for deportation and, kind of feel like this is a no-brainer, right? Like I've never been arrested before. I know the circumstances of my arrest, all the things that I'd done while I had been incarcerated. I had a good disciplinary record. I had done like all my programs, and the reason that I'm actually getting this parole board is because I actually did all the things to qualify for it. So to me, it's like a no-brainer. And I remember, going to that parole hearing, and it was just like, as soon as I got in, it was just like we were at war. It's like they were just coming at me, and I never experienced, like I'd experienced the invisibility of the system, right? But like again, no one ever talked to me, right? Like, when you go to courts, it's like they're talking to your lawyers. No one. This was the first time I felt like someone talked to me, and the violence in which they spoke to me, right? The lack of curiosity in which they afforded me, right? Like it was just like, wow, like, it just felt, and then this is, people that are entrusted with your freedom, right? So like it feels like, my God, like are you even going to try to find out who I am? And I think the more that I wanted to create space for critical conversation, in their minds felt like I was shirking accountability. And for them, accountability was simply, I'm guilty, I've done wrong. Like, no mitigating factors, right? Like, I'm guilty, I'm wrong, like, please redeem me, right? And I think because I didn't come in that way, um, in their minds, they felt that I was stuck in accountability, and it just felt like extremely violent and confusing. And I remember leaving that hearing, and I knew, in my heart told me that, oh my God, you're not going home. Like this is not like how people talk to you if you're going home. I left that hearing, and I just felt like, it is the worst feeling. I think, outside of losing people, I think that being denied parole is probably one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, right? Like, and I think too, in the book, I hope that I can help people to think about what that must feel for somebody, right? To, like you've been in prison for 3 years, and here's an opportunity for you to get out of prison, even if it's for deportation, and people refuse to see you, right? Like people, it is so like a violent thing, and then to be denied, and you have to live with that. You begin to question yourself. Did I do something? Could I have done more? Could I have said more? You replay the hearing over and over and over, and then you have to tell everybody else, right? Like you have to, explain to your family, your kids, like why, right? Like no one can understand why, because they're like, well, I thought you were doing all these good things. I thought you were doing all these programs. And then you're often denied for, the way the parole board works, you're often denied for the one thing that you can't change. So the parole board shouldn't be considering your crime. That's why you're sentenced. That's why you went through the court process, is so that they could consider the crime, the mitigating factors, and determine your sentence. But the parole board feels empowered, like, oh no, like our job is to do that, right? Versus actually, like, what have I done while I've been incarcerated? Who am I now? What are my plans, when I get out of prison? Those things feel like, oh no, we want to talk about the one thing that you can't change, which is your crime of conviction. And this is how the parole board, operates, right? Everyone is denied often for their crime of conviction, the one thing you can't change. So again, it creates this feeling of powerlessness, right? Like if I'm going to be, I can't change this. So I have a life sentence. Every time I come to the parole board, you can then deny me for my crime of conviction, because this is the one thing that I can't change.
Hmm. Yeah, could you maybe, you just mentioned having to talk to your family like about the outcome. And yeah, I just wanted to hear you talk a bit more about um, how your relationship with your family evolved across the different prisons that you're in, because obviously, like initially you're in Rikers, which is like just not far from where you grew up, not far from New York City. whereas then you go upstate and it just gets harder for your family to come see you. So yeah, like how is that playing into everything that you're experiencing at this point?
Yeah. So I was really blessed that to have, a family, right? And I think that is something that for so many people that are incarcerated, many of them unfortunately have to, like do those spaces by themselves. And I'm extremely blessed that from Rikers Island to Coxsackie to Green to Wyoming, like my family was there, and it wasn't always just visits, it was phone calls. And I think the phone calls were exorbitant at that point, right? I think a 30-minute phone call could run upwards of $30, right? So imagine, calling your family a few times a week. So my family was incredible. Letters, my family was just so incredibly supportive. Heather, who is my daughter's mom, I remember, you know, Rikers obviously is a lot closer, right? Green wasn't bad, but then when I went to like Wyoming, she would have to take a bus at midnight from the city that takes 7 hours to go upstate, right? To then spend 5 6 hours in a visitor room, to then take a bus back 7 hours, right? So like that, the level of commitment from my family, friends, and loved ones was really incredible. And the fact that not only the fact which made then the parole denials even tougher, because I felt like you know I would have three parole denials through this process, right? And with each denial, it wasn't just for me. I felt like actually I felt more pain for them. I felt more pain that I would have to continue to subject them to this experience. Because at this point for me, not to say that I wasn't hurting, but I feel that I'd learned to survive. I learned to survive, and I was committed to surviving. And I was also aware, though, that this was creating a strain on my family and loved ones. So the denials felt like really hurtful, right? Like they hurt me in a deep way because, again, I just they couldn't understand. They really couldn't understand, like why they're trying to deport you. Why wouldn't they let you out, right? And so having to always like relive these things with my family were incredibly tough and incredibly challenging. But again, like I'm so fortunate to have had a family to really support me like in this system, right? Because again, there's no one that survives these systems without family, right? And it's and it was multitude of family, right? It was the family inside, the Blisses, the Pops, the Ninjas, but then it was also like my family outside. So again, there's so many people that are directly responsible for like not only my survival but my thriving post incarceration.
I think, yeah, these sources of connection clearly seem to be like really important in terms of retaining a sense of humanization, like in the face of pervasive dehumanization. And during your time, you partake in something called the Human Relations Therapeutic Program. And there's a part in which you're describing your participation where you're helping run this program, and a participant says something that I thought was really, 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 really sharp and really hit me. And that was, the system is always talking about accountability, but who is going to be accountable to us?
Yeah.
What was it like hearing that? Like, what does that mean to you?
It makes me want to cry, if I'm being honest with you, because I think that that was such a vulnerable space, right? And I felt so privileged that these men were able to like share with me their stories, and many of them the level of violence that they've experienced, right? And I just remember that really shook me up, because where does accountability start? And I think like we often there are places in the book I'm sure I'm ranting, but I'm just like, where does accountability start? And the people that always want to talk about accountability, it often starts, at a place that isn't fair, Like we can't talk about accountability for people in carceral systems if we're not talking about the historical violence they've been subjected to. And so that's always just like really stood with me because, you know, like many of these, that program in particular, like many of those men were men who, you know, were seen as some of the worst people in society, you know, but when you heard their stories, you understood their pain, you understood their actions. And, you know, what he was asking of me is something that I feel, you know, I've taken and I'm asking of the system, right? Like, where does accountability start? You know, are you really willing to look at, you know, like there's this Tupac song and he's like, yo, you know, I think Meek Mill's sampled it. It's not even a song, you know, but it's when he's coming out of court and he's like, America eats their babies, you know, and he's like, you know, like, and it's real, like, right? These systems are so violent. Like Tupac, for example, like he was born into a system. His mother was incarcerated. His mother was on Rikers pregnant with him, right? Had to, you know, survive, you know, the COINTELPRO, the violence against his family, had to survive like poverty, substance abuse, right? So it's like folks, by the time they get to the carceral spaces, have survived so much violence, and yet no one wants to honor or even see that, right? But they want them to be accountable to their acts of violence, right? And I don't think that is justice. I think justice can only happen when we're looking at this system as a whole.
Hmm. And like through all these difficult times, like it's hard to believe that there's a possibility of like a good outcome or hope. But in 2001, you filed an appeal on your deportation order, and things look a little bit different. So can you walk us through what the appeal was like and how that ultimately ends?
Yeah, so like 2001, so even getting to 2001, right? There is two more parole denials, right? So there's a parole denial in 1999, which is devastating, right? The parole denial in 1999, because after parole denial in 97, right? Like the next parole was December 1999. So then to have another parole denial for the same reason was devastating. And then now 2001, I actually have 7 years in. So right, like from 1994 to 2001, I didn't even think that I would do a year in prison, that somebody would have surely, like, you know, saw that there was a mistake somewhere. So now I have 7 years in, and another parole denial at the beginning of the year, so three parole denials, right? And so at this point, I'm also in Wyoming, and I'm in a dorm with predominantly Caribbean people, and predominantly people who are in the same situation as I am. You know, have immigration warrants that are doing various levels of advocacy. And it was such a blessing because then, you know, I felt like I just had greater wealth and access to information. And so around this time, I hear of a case that went to the Supreme Court, Saint Cyr versus INS, and I'll never forget this, Saint Cyr, right? And he had a similar case as mine, criminal possession, or a criminal possession case, and he argued to the Supreme Court that, you know, the 1996 immigration laws should not have been held retroactive, and thus that his order of deportation should be reverse. And he ultimately won. And so what this meant was that I would be able to do something similar. So, and I remember, you know, putting together the appeal, which I did myself. I had studied the law by this point. I was a regular in the law library, and with the help of a few friends in the dorm, I put together my own appeal. So this is probably like summer 2001. So then fast forward to September, and you know, I was actually teaching an HRTP on September 11th, 2001. And I remember I'm teaching a class, and then we get the announcement that we needed to go back to the dorm. And so I remember that morning was commissary. So I was excited to go to commissary. I'm kind of like aggravated, like, why are we going back to the dorm? And so I remember getting back to the dorm, and or even before getting back to the dorm, I remember being on the walkway, and like there were all types of conversations happening. People are talking about planes like flew into like buildings in Manhattan. It all sounded so wild. And I remember getting back to a dorm and everyone is just around the TV, and they were watching the events of 9/11 unfold. And I remember just, being like stunned like everyone else. I remember, going to the phones to try to call to make sure that, my family was okay. At the time, Heather, my daughter's mother worked in the area. So I was really like worried about her. And, so for a few days, the phones were not working. And, so there was so much anxiety. And ultimately, I was able to find her and, she was okay, or get in contact with her. She was okay. Um, but then like 2 days or 3 days after 9/11, I get mail and I found out that my case was reopened. My immigration case was reopened. So, it just felt like there'd been so many defeats, defeats, that September 2001 was the first time where I felt like, oh my God, like, wow, there's, a light possibly at the end of the tunnel, because I was really becoming resigned to maybe I would not get out of prison. And think about how wild this is, that I was arrested at 18. Now, 7 years later, I'm like 25, 26, right? And I'm almost like have lost hope that I would ever get out of prison. And so when I won the right to have my immigration case reopened, this was really huge. And I would have a hearing and ultimately have my immigration case reopened, and would be able to put together a team. And there was a immigration attorney that I would speak to on three-way, which was illegal, but my aunt would call him up, like, and just he ran an immigration hotline, Manny Vargas, and I would just always ask him questions, and we began to build a relationship. So when I got my immigration case reopened, I remember calling him and saying like, "Hey, I won this case. I got my case reopened," and he actually volunteered to represent me pro bono. So that was like, again, that was like my second win. So then I was able to have this really experienced immigration attorney and his law intern at that time, Kevin Lapp, begin to work on my case. And what they would do over a period of months was really speak with my family, collect evidence, letters, which would then be presented in my immigration hearing, which was called a 212C hearing, which is a waiver hearing. It no longer exists, but it existed as a relief for people who had been convicted of crimes. And it was a humane way for the court to kind of like see you and to see the mitigating factors, right? Not just your charges, but to really see you as a human being, to see your family, to see the mitigating factors. And so I was able to have a hearing at Downstate in January 2002 or February 2002, and I ultimately won. So then this was like my third win, right? Case. And so from 1996 to 2002, almost 6 years, I've been fighting this order of deportation, and I finally won in 2002. So that was like really, I think when I won that, that's when I feel I kind of saw the door opening, right? So that there was a possibility of a light at the end of the tunnel.
And speaking of light at the end of the tunnel, shortly after you have your fourth parole hearing, and even just walking the door, like the vibe seems totally different from the first three parole hearings. So what changed, and how were you received at that fourth parole hearing?
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit, right? So, I win the immigration case. It's like probably January, February. In May, I get my college degree, which I get my associate's degree, which is like incredible, right? Like, at a point where there's no education in these spaces, to have this college program, to be able to earn an associate's degree was so incredible, right? So it's like, it's not only, I feel like, I went from losing to now I'm like, yo, I'm winning, right? I've actually, I've won my immigration case. I've just gotten my college degree. So I'm really feeling good now. I'm really starting to feel like there's a possibility. And so I'm preparing to go to my fourth parole board, which would be then in February 2003. So in December in Wyoming, there is all of a sudden like a lot of movements. But for me, I'm not expected to be moved because I'm going to the parole board in 2 months. And usually when you go into the parole board in like 2, 3 months, there is no movement. And then also I have a college hold because I'm in college. So I'm not expecting any type of movement. I'm expecting to complete like my fourth parole board probably in Wyoming. And I remember it was the day after Christmas, and the CO stops by my cell and he says, I was in a dorm actually. He stops by my cube and he says, like, pack up. I was like, pack up? What do you mean? And so I pack up and I go to the draft room, and they're like, you're going to Arthur Kill. And to put this in context, right? Like, so all the state prisons at this time, they're all like hundreds of miles away from New York City. Arthur Kill is the only state prison that is in New York City. It's actually, people don't consider Staten Island, New York City before Wu-Tang, but it's actually like on Staten Island. So it's in New York City. It had been like urban lore, right? Nobody goes to Arthur Kill. So for me, all of a sudden, like to have, like I'd been in all these horrible prisons, and right now I'm by like the Canadian border. So to pack up to go to Arthur Kill was just really weird. But I remember, just the excitement of like, my God, I'm going back to New York City after being away for like 9 years, right? Even though I'm still incarcerated, I'm going back to New York City. And I remember like just crossing the Tri-Bar Bridge, which is like a bridge that kind of, it's probably the point where you separate like upstate New York, right? Or going upstate New York from New York City. And I remember crossing the Tri-Bar Bridge, and like we picked up Hot 97, and there's Cam and Jay-Z's Welcome to New York City like came on, and I was just like, my God, I just like really burst out into tears. Like it was such a, even to this day when I hear the song, I still feel like that, like it was so beautiful to get back to New York City. And so I remember getting into Arthur Kill, and whenever you go to a new jail, they have to do an intake interview. And so the CO, like that's doing the intake interview, he says, do you know why you're here? I'm like, no, I don't know why I'm here, right? And he's like, you're going home, don't fuck up. And I was like, what? People say the system is rigged, don't ask me, right? But like, I like, he literally says to me, he's like, but I couldn't believe him, right? Like because that's too vulnerable. I would make myself too vulnerable. I just got 3 parole denials, right? So I want to believe, but I can't believe him. And so I remember, like the rumors were that, the parole board in Arthur Kill was, a lot better than the other places. And so I remember going to the parole hearing, and, as soon as I got into the parole hearing, it was just different. It was really different. It was the first time that I felt like seen. I felt like it was the first time somebody was actually like really willing to see my humanity, and I didn't know if I was going to make the parole board or not, but I know I felt good, like being seen as a human being and being seen in like my totality. And the conversation was just like radically different than any other conversation that I ever had with the parole board. And I just felt like leaving that hearing, that like again, I felt in my soul, my spirit, I knew that I was home. Yeah.
No, like that's the first time in almost a decade where the system sees you as a human being. So
Yeah.
for the weight of that to really land, like,
Yeah, I share in the book,
so
right? And there's this irony, because there's this there's this white woman who was a parole commissioner, and I remember she just sat next to me like before the hearing started, right? And she was like, I can't believe that you've been denied parole 3 times. And whew, I just remember, like, it felt like so disoriented, you know, like to have had that experience where like no one sees you, and to have an experience where, you know, like I was armored up, you know, like the parole board, you got to armor up. So I felt like discombobulated, like, oh my God, stop, I'm gonna cry, you know, like I need to armor up for this. But I didn't need to, right? Like I didn't need to. And I don't know who that woman was. I've never even looked at the papers to see who she was, but like, you know, if she ever sees this, you know, I'm grateful. Like I'm grateful, you know, I think the system is horrible and it's, you know, really inhumane, but I'm grateful that that day, like, you know, they were willing to see me. You know, and I hope that, you know, for everybody that reads this book, you know, that's really like my goal, is that we're curious about people behind numbers, behind labels, right? Like we're willing to, you know, really understand that everyone has a story. Everyone is, you know, no one is just a number. We're talking about like mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, you know, and it's our duty, if we're ever going to create a world that is, that has justice, right? That it has to start with our willingness to see people.
Yeah, I feel like there's well, I mean, it's interesting, I guess, like this way that this fourth parole involves this yeah, like kind of beginning of your, you could say, rehumanization, and you then begin this process of, like, you describe it as re-entry, and you talk about like this myth of rehabilitation as a goal of the carceral system and what that taught you about like the necessity of abolition. So can you yeah, just talk about what that process was like?
Yeah, well, I think again, for me coming home, right? For me coming out of prison, I didn't think that I was free. And it wasn't because um I didn't have enough rights or whatever. It was just really that understanding that I knew that we couldn't be free. I couldn't be free unless we were all free. I really understood what the system is. I understood that the risks that, you know, having three brothers at home, having, you know, a black son, you know, I really understood that this is not a system that is reformable. This system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. One of my mentors, Eddie Ellis, always says that, you know, he has this thing that he would say is like, you know, McDonald's always brags about, you know, billions served, right? Imagine 70% of those billions were returned, you know, with McDonald's still being business. And so we have a carceral system that returns, you know, 70% of people continually, right, that live in this loop, and never goes out of business because that is the business. So for me, you know, it wasn't about like, how do I make this system more humane? How do I reform the system? No, the only option is, how do we like destroy the system? How do we re-envision, you know, human engagements? How do we re-envision accountability, right? And it doesn't mean that people won't create harm, or you know, we won't have to at certain points, maybe, you know, like remove people from society, but it's really understanding that the carceral system that exists right now is predicated on racism, it's predicated on anti-blackness, and it's predicated on capitalism and the exploitation of black and brown bodies. And if we're going to do something different, you know, it begins with that like recognition and a willingness to really, really, really rethink what justice is.
And just last question, sort of bring this to the present. Like, we live in a time right now where we're seeing like mass expansion of incarceration, but this time maybe immigrant detention as opposed to just more typical forms of detention. So what do you think 94A6325 can tell us about the times that we're living through now, and what lesson can be carried forward?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things that I always talk about is that, you know, there are no single issue issues, right? I think so often in America, We don't see like even this idea of immigration, right? No one asks like, why are people coming to America? I know for me, I didn't want to come to America, right? Like I love Jamaica. I love growing up in Jamaica. And no one really again thinks about like how American foreign policy is like destabilizing countries throughout the world. And I know what American foreign policy, like what we're witnessing right now, like the imperialistic violence being perpetuated by the United States, by Israel, right? I know what that feels like. I come from a country that was destabilized. So I really understand what that feels like. I understand what coming to America and being subjected to racism feels like, being subjected to communities that are marginalized, that are over policed feels like, right? I know how easy it is for young people to get caught up in the carceral system or to get caught up in behaviors that are criminalized. So for me, again, 94A6325 is a call-in for people to think about like, why are we labeling immigrants as criminals, right? Like, why are so many people like fleeing their countries, and how can we really create like a system of equity, right? Not only in America but throughout the world. Because when you look at like so many of these countries that are considered democratic, what they've really done is not democracy. It's not like it's not justice, it's not liberation, it's exploitation, it's domination. And so for many of these things that like we're seeing happening right now, they're not new. I often say to people that like what's happening with ICE, it's happening because many people turn a blind eye to the carceral genocide. Like these militarized policing has been happening in our communities for decades now, right? And many people have turned a blind eye to that. So these aren't separate stories, right? The story of the carceral system, the story of the immigration system, the story of any type of marginalization, they're not separate stories. They're all interconnected. They're all, like rooted in the same level of imperialistic, racist violence that is America.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a powerful way of like wrapping it all up. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us. And it's been such a pleasure both talking to you today, but also reading your story. I think it's a wonderful story. And I think people will really, really feel these things that you're describing when reading it as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Could I say one last thing, right? So I want to really say shout out to Daraja, shout out to Feroz, shout out to you all, right? As someone who believes that, a big part of this moment is our ability to empower impacted people to tell their stories, right? Like I believe people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but often furthest from the resources. And, my experience even, shopping this story is that a lot of people who profess this, right? They're not really about that. They're really about like wanting to exploit or really wanting to package stories in a certain way in which they feel that could be marketable. So I just want to say that this is a time, right, where we're seeing journalism compromise in so many ways that we have to like really honor like independent presses, not-for-profit presses, people who are really like standing true to like collective liberation right now. So I think I really want to say that and honor you all for like supporting this story, because this is what we all have to do now in this moment. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jay, for those comments. But really, it's to thank you for what you have helped all of us realize some aspects of our own humanity. I have one question to ask, and this is directed at Io and Russell. You've read this book, you've done so much editing and so on. What was your reaction to this book?
Here, you go first. You go first.
Sure. I mean, as soon as I picked up the book, I couldn't put it down. It's a roller coaster, emotionally and like narratively. I think the book is really, yeah, it really it's harrowing in many ways, just because of how, yeah, like easy it is, I feel, to put yourself, or at least it was for me, to put myself in Jay's shoes. Um, it's a period in time that I have like some relatively decent familiarity with, and in that being like the US, New York, in the 90s, throughout the 90s. Um, but I just never really had the perspective of what that was like as in this narrative form from a young black person. Like I know a lot of I grew up listening to like Wu-Tang and Nas, so I knew the music. I didn't really know the reality so well. Like for it to see, so to see the life of an individual young black man caught up in this, um, caught up in like the mass incarceration, the carceral genocide, um, and to see like how just to get this in such an embodied way that I could really relate to myself. Um, yeah, like the book really is like no other, I think, in that way. Um, yeah, like the blending of all these different uh both like cultural events, so the music, like the OJ chase, 9/11, Lauryn Hill, the crime bill, the immigration laws, like these are all many things that like many of us have heard about, and seeing Jay's life uh like just cut through all of these events from the position of being so unjustly incarcerated throughout, yeah, like pretty much the entire 90s. It's just, yeah, it's just really it just really stayed with me.
Russell.
I would say like the word embodied. I really agree with that, and that really resonates with me because, like I was saying, like as a young black man myself, like I know the ways in which this world wants to strip your humanity away, and it wants to put you in a box, and it wants to deny you the same rights that other people have, and the same open mindedness to your full humanity. So to read such like a vivid account of like what that's like to have that so violently taken away from you, like for me it was deeply impactful. Like I felt really connected to your experience while reading through it. And I'm 27 now. Like I'm around the age you were when you finished your bid after 9 years. So for me, like my entire adult life, there's so much wrapped up in like how I perceive my entire adult life. So for that to be behind bars in this violent system day in, day out, like for me, like it was no, I was like really, really emotional reading some of those like more difficult sections, be it just seeing the daily violence that you're subjected to, both between prisoners, but the system itself, as well as like the ways in which you're just denied any sort of recognition or any sort of uh, option for being a full human being who has done some things that we're not proud of, but has also, in many ways, like been part of a broader system, and it's not just your position in that. So, for me, like embodied really captures like what that experience was like, and I feel like I really feel like I got to know someone like really well just reading it, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, I think I'd like to sort of emphasize that. I mean, this is apparently a book about you, but that it's a huge gift to all of us, and it is about your struggle to reclaim your humanity, and that is a struggle all of us are engaged in. And so, thank you for what you've done, Jay. Extraordinary. And this is a joint publication between the Raja Press and Mart Media. And I look forward to the next volumes. This is just volume 1. So thank you for this gift, Jay, and for a really excellent, very, very interesting interview. 1 hour, 50 minutes, but my God, I could sit here all day and listen to it as well. But thank you, Russell. Thank you, Ayo. And above all, thank you, Jay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you all. It's honestly, I'm so privileged and honored to be part of this moment, this community, and again, just eternally grateful for the support.
Okay, I'm ending the recording now, and then but don't rush away, as there's a lot of